like, okay, I practice it for an hour and like, wow, like look how good I'm doing. Rather than when I started this from yesterday's practice, boy, it was not doing so good. And when I start it tomorrow, it's kind of rocky. So here's the uncomfortable truth. The measure, so this is where she says it in her own words that I stole. The measure of how well you practiced isn't how good it sounds at the end of your practice session. It's how good it sounds the next day when you come back to it. We love that. Okay. When we sound fantastic during practice only to play terribly in a lesson, we have fallen victim to the illusion of mastery. Illusions, Michael. Okay. When we decide to do a run through and then stop on the first or second line a few times before making it through, who hasn't done that? Convincing ourselves that those first few poor tries are because I'm not warmed up yet. Yep. Not in the groove yet, or we are falling to the victim of illusion of mastery. Okay. A distinction that is not clear to many musicians, and certainly was not to me, that's Dr. Gebrian, is that just because you can play something does not necessarily mean that you can also perform it. Yeah, zoinks. Okay. So we tend to think that if we can play it, we can automatically perform it. This is something I find with students all the time, all the time, all the time. I'm begging you, do practice performances. Play, take your chair into other rooms in your house and do it. Invite friends over to do it. Go to the open mic and play for them and this, that, the other thing. So all that, you got to do it. You got to do it because it shows you where it really is at. And it also kind of vents the nerves and it just, a lot of things happen. Cinema does this all the time. When I'm over at Cinema, I'll watch these people who are working for the Coupe Mondiale or the Trophy Mondiale, these big competitions where they want to win these prizes. And it's like, super high stress. They're working for a year on a piece, one song, 1 8-minute song for an entire year. And they're on the program along with everybody else that's taking that week, that stage. And they're there playing their thing because even if it's just part of it, and it sounds not great, clunky, and like they know, because most of them have been there for years and years, so they understand the deal. And at first I was like, like that's interesting. Like it's not at all ready. It sounds really bad, but you're gonna perform it. Okay. But it's for the whole thing. Like the more you perform it, the more it gets better. So that's something slightly different, but very much related. Okay. Okay. So then she says, well, when Evan, so this is the violinist or violist at the beginning of the chapter, when that student came, he seemed unprepared and she realized he could play the Bach just fine, but he couldn't perform it. And those are two different things. So you're training your brain to play it and we have to do that as the beginning step. So we have to do the block practice and her, 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, take a day off, do a day on, day off, day on, day off, a week off, do it, 2 weeks off, do it. And then it's there. And then you've got that section and then you need to start putting it together and then you need to do the interleaved practice. Okay. So now there's, let's see. Yeah, okay, so now she says, before learning about interleaved practice, this is exactly what I would do in the practice room. I did lots of repetitions focusing on one thing for a long time before moving on to something else. Blocked practice. So she's saying that she did block practice. Then she would get on stage or go to her lesson and somehow expect her brain to know exactly how to perform on the first try. Interleaved performance. Aha, blocked practice. So we need interleaved practice for interleaved performance. So performance, by its very definition, is interleaved. You don't get to do it and do it and do it and do it. Okay. And so no wonder I was often disappointed. Okay. So to answer this question, let's look at it. Experiment. So, the question is, okay. So here, these ideas seem to, so she's talking about, let me read this whole thing. I should have highlighted this. This idea of switching off in between different sections or passages goes against how many of us were taught to practice. How many of us were taught to practice. After all, in chapter 1, we were talking about the importance of making well-worn pathways through the snow. We were talking about correct repetitions and overlearning. These ideas seem to be contradictory and raise the question, does blocked practice have any place at all? Does it? Or should we only be doing interleaved practice? And she said, let's look at an experiment that was done with basketball players. In this study, there were 3 groups, a blocked practice group, an interleaved practice group, and a group that had an increasingly interleaved practice schedule. To illustrate what this third group did, she's going to return to her example of musicians. So she'll go back to this idea of orchestra excerpt. So to tell us what the increasingly random schedule, if it were applied to music, so block practice would be 30 minutes of each excerpt. Let's see. Oh, increasingly random schedule. So you would you would start with doing block practice. So you do 30 minutes of each excerpt before moving on to the next. Then you would do serial practice. So you would do you do a piece for 5 minutes and then move on to the next one, but you do it in a predictable order. So it'd be the Don Juan piece, the Mendelssohn piece, the Beethoven piece, the Don Juan piece, the Mendelssohn piece, the Beethoven piece, the Don Juan piece, the Mendelssohn piece, the Beethoven piece, etc. And your brain gets practice switching gears, but it can predict between the switching. Then the final step of this process would be then interleaved practice, 5 minutes of each piece in a random order. And this is exactly what I suggest students do. Exactly. I had no idea about this. I'm sure I don't claim to have come up with all these ideas. I took them and kind of added my own stuff, but this is exactly what I do with, okay, you want to work between voicings with roots in them and rootless voicings on this song. First, make sure you can do the entire song. So do block practice. Now I have more language for it. Do block practice, only the new chord voicing, rootless chord voicings. Okay. Can you do it through the whole thing? Great. Did you do block practice? Wonderful. Now we're going to do predictable switching. So 4 bars, you do your chord voicings with roots, then you switch. So you ask your brain to call it up. Next 4 bars. So you make it nice and easy at the beginning. And then you make that more challenging. So once you can do switch every 4 bars, because once you're into it, so you're switching less, fewer switching. So easier to do, easier for the brain, right, to recall. Then once you do that, then make it faster. So switch every 2 bars. So my chords that I already know, and then the new chords that don't have roots. Okay, so 2 bars. 2 bars of what I already know, 2 bars of the new thing that I'm trying to get deeper. And then 1 bar, right? And you do things where you then start with the new thing for the 2 bars and switch, right? So you got to practice all the possible variations. And then what I would just say is then at the end, you finish your practice by just randomly doing it. You just try to improvise stuff, which is a way of doing her final step, which is truly interleaved. And she talks about you can get a random number generator, you could roll a die, there's a number of ways you could figure out a random sequence. But anyways, so that's increasingly random scheduled, and that's really cool. And so the experimenters found that so the results of this is that the group with the increasingly interleaved schedule did the best of all. So boom, way to go. All right. The researchers speculated that first you have to solidify the skill using blocked practice. Then you have to increase the level of difficulty by moving on to serial practice. And my version is increasing the difficulty in serial practice, right? Inside of it before you move on to something random. And then finally, you need to test whether you can perform well no matter what by doing interleaved practice. So in my experience, this is definitely true. If I can't play something 5 times in a row the way I want, I won't be able to reliably perform it perfectly on the first try. It's just not solid enough. So I have to she's saying she has to do solid block practice first to learn and solidify the basic news. Okay. Right. So that's always, and this is explaining well, should I only do interleave? She's like, no, you got to do the block practice first, and then after it's solid, then you start mixing it up and changing it with other sections. And that's what really sets it and makes it start to get ready for performance. Okay. Brain activation. Okay. So, what is going on during interleave versus block practice? Is there evidence? And yeah, they put people in an fMRI machine that shows the activity of the brain, or areas of the brain when someone's doing something. And in this experiment, participants were asked to do a variety of complex button press sequences using both blocked and interleaved practice methods. After a break, the participants had to perform the button press sequences as best they could while still in the scanner. So perform, not practice, so just go, do it. And it shows the same thing. And so it also shows that when they were doing the interleaved practice, the brains were very, very highly activated and working hard. In comparison, the brain wasn't doing nearly as much when the participants were doing the blocked practice. Okay, so the brain is working way more when you're doing interleaved. So then She says, fascinating result is that what the researchers saw in the performance. So we had the practice. During the practice, the interleaved practice is getting the brain to work more. Then in the performance, it gets the brain to, the interleaved practicers, when they went to perform, the brain was doing a lot less because that's what it should be doing. So when the participants performed the sequences they had learned using interleaved practice, their brains were barely doing anything at all. Read that again. Their brains were barely doing anything at all in a performance. Minimal brain activation means it's easy for the brain, so doing interleaved practice makes performing feel effortless, and that's really cool. In contrast, the people who did the blocked practice, their brains were doing a lot more when they were performing, which, like, that makes sense. If you don't know something well, like me at the Guy Kulisevsek concert, I was like, oh shit, don't fuck this up, don't fuck this up. You know, things were not, I did not give enough time for everything to get super in there. So I was like, okay, God, let me just keep warming up and keep this under my fingers. And then, okay, here we go. And like, don't forget, this is the next thing. Don't forget, da, da, da. And so my brain was going super active when, if I had more time and things got learned more to the reflex, it wouldn't be that. And then I could think about all the other stuff, which is connecting with the audience, expressing, saying like, oh yeah, I feel this coming up and I feel this coming down. Okay. All right. And so here we have charts that represent that. Okay. Yes. So so then she started talking about how, like, when we're performing, we can feel, when we're actually performing, we feel like we're, you know, she uses the bit discombobulated when they get on stage, performers do. Therefore, we want to make it as easy as possible for our brains when we place them in a performance situation. And she talks a little tiny bit about anxiety, but not very much. Let's see. The researchers measured something called motor cortex excitability, which is a measure of motor cortex activity in the brain as it relates to reaction time. The more excitability there is, the faster the reaction time. Blocked practice had no effect on motor cortex excitability, whereas the excitability was significantly increased as a result of interleaved practice. In other words, interleaved practice improved reaction time, yet another benefit from practicing this way. So, when exactly should you start doing interleaved practice? So, she says that the basketball study shows that at the beginning you should do it blocked practice and then gradually transition to interleaved practice. But she said a different experiment, however, suggests that doing some interleaved practice from the very beginning can be beneficial. And because I'm continuing to work on this Guy Kulisevsek music, but I can start other stuff and I'm all jazzed up from it, I'm starting a few new things. So I'm very interested to try this, and this is what I will be trying on some new music that I'm working on, is doing a lot of block practice on new stuff, but trying to do some interleaved practice as well. So let's see. In this study, researchers looked at areas of the brain that were communicating with each other 1 week after learning something new. When participants used blocked practice to learn a new skill, researchers saw communication between prefrontal cortex and anterior putamen. This brain activation is typical for something new, so that wasn't surprising. However, when participants practiced the new skill using interleaved practice, researchers found something unexpected. The sensoromotor cortex and the posterior putamen were communicating with each other, completely different parts of the brain. This is especially surprising because these two areas are associated with long-term storage of a skill. You only expect these two areas to be communicating once you get better at the skill, not when it's still new. So that's really cool. So we should be doing this early in, and she's going to give us practice strategies. So she says, essentially doing interleaved practice from the beginning jumpstarts the learning process, and pushes us to a higher level of skill much sooner in the process, at least in terms of the brain areas involved. In fact, in many studies on interleaved practice, people are practicing a brand new skill, and yet the benefits of this practice method are still seen in performance tests. That's really cool. Okay, so although this is an absolutely essential practice method for performing well, it's also something we should be using at every stage of the learning process. All right, so now